I'm the co-founder of Foragvest Greening, delighted to be sponsoring this panel on landscape reforestation. Just very briefly, we've decided to introduce ourselves. I'll be introducing everybody first, and then just on background, and then we will be proceeding with individual presentations of the members of the panel. So just very briefly about myself. Foragvest Greening is focused on landscape restoration, specifically in Paraguay. My background is in forestry for the last 15 years. I've been involved in the last 20 years in establishing businesses from startups to operatives all over Central Eastern Europe. I've also worked a lot in the Nordics, in France, and currently now in South America. Foragvest Greening, our team, and me specifically, I got invited to take part by the UK DIT, Department of International Trade, to be part of an agri delegation to Paraguay in the summer of 2017. And today we're here ready to develop projects. So Foragvest Greening is a project development outfit for reforestation at scale in Paraguay. Backgrounds on the guests: Michele Zollinger from Nestle, Global Sustainable Sourcing, Pulp and Paper and Climate Lead at Nestle. Michele supports Nestle's pulp and paper suppliers in executing sustainable sourcing practices across the global supply chain. She is also responsible for the implementation of Nestle's global reforestation program. We look forward to hearing about that. Prior to Nestle, Michele led Qantas's global nature climate solutions service, supporting companies in the agricultural and food sector in measuring their land use change impacts in their corporate value chain. Background: master in environmental management with focus on business and environment from Yale, and a bachelor in international relations from the University of Geneva. Next panelist with Mark Moroge from Rainforest Alliance, serves as Senior Director of Latin America for the Rainforest Alliance, where he's advanced partnerships with companies, communities, and government in various roles for 13 years. Mark supports a rapidly growing team of over 130 across 9 countries, covering all of Rainforest Alliance's programming areas, from landscape initiatives and sustainable supply chains and certification to policy support and innovations. Mark works in partnerships, served as catalyst for innovative initiatives on climate change and landscape management, such as the Land Scale tool, and Mark will be telling us about the Rainforest Alliance's Land Scale tool in this panel. Mark has a degree in natural resources ecology and Spanish from the University of Idaho, that speaks English, Spanish, and French. Peter Owens, who is part of the Foragvest Greening team, a partner from Colour. He's a founder of Colour in the year 2000, and his purpose was to reshape the role of landscape architecture in the 21st century. Peter is a chartered landscape architect, master planner, and urban designer as well, grounded by an environmental sciences first degree. He has 30 years experience of large budget schemes within multidisciplinary teams across Britain and the world, informed in the dynamics of environmental solutions and passionate about the sensitive interface of ecology with development through restorative landscapes. He is author of groundbreaking dissertation on zero carbon landscape design, 1995, and won the Landscape Institute's Best Large-Scale Development in the UK in 2016. Also delivered on best practices in the Middle East for a global sports tournament in Qatar in 2022, and he is a chartered member of the Landscape Institute. He is also a fellow of the Royal Society for the Encouragement of Arts, Manufacturers and Commerce. And then Ed Adams, who is Technical Director at Foragvest Greening, responsible for design and implementation of landscape restoration projects, farmed for over 25 years in UK, France, New Zealand, Australia, and Papua New Guinea, worked in forestry and timber with particular expertise in silvopastoral systems, and he will be talking about that during this panel. Specific experience in water management in rural communities, as well as animal care and grass management techniques for low input beef production. He is experienced in liaising with communities, with commercial and governmental agencies, as with NGOs. And he has served in the UK military in specialist roles. Ed has a degree in agriculture and environmental sciences, specialised in tropical soils and land resources from the University of Newcastle, and his ongoing postgraduate study in forestry. So that is a presentation of each member of the panel. I will now just talk very briefly about Foragvest greening before handing over to Michele. We, as said, are focused on landscape restoration projects in Paraguay, specifically addressing the issue of deforestation of the Atlantic forest in the oriental part of Paraguay. And our real purpose and commitment is to implement holistically, both on the forestry, the rural side, the rural economy, and all the benefits that trickle down. I will now hand over to Michele for her to introduce herself. Michele, please, can you hear?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, William. I'm really excited to be able to speak on this panel, so thanks for the invitation. And I we were asked to kind of talk about why methodologies and metrics are critical to this topic about landscape scale. So maybe allow me first to give a little bit of context of how Nestle is thinking about this approach, and then also with this kind of explain why metrics and methodologies are so critical for the from a corporate perspective. So in 2019, Nestle made its commitment to become net zero by 2050, and with that also half its emission by 2030. And what that really means is we set targets in 2025, 2030, and 2050 that are all aligned with the Science-Based Target Initiative. Now, you need to keep in mind that as a food and beverage company, most of our impact is really associated with our ingredients that we source. And what that actually means is over 70% of our footprint comes from our ingredients. And most of this impact is driven by land use change or deforestation. So if you go and look at our climate strategy, it won't be a surprise that you'll see most of the actions that we're trying to undertake this year and the coming years is going to be about implementing regenerative practices, ensuring no deforestation is happening in our supply chain, agroforestry projects, silvopasture projects, as well as conserving and restoring forests or peatlands. At the same time, what we also just recently published was the forest positive strategy that was really building off of over 10 years of experience now working on our no deforestation commitment. And I want to bring this up because we had some really relevant learnings from that our 10 years of experience that really challenged us now to shift our mindset. And this is kind of what this forest positive strategy entails. There are very specifically two ways of how we realized we actually need to shift our mindset. The first one is about ensuring, we need to move from ensuring that our supply chain doesn't convert natural landscapes to also ensuring that our supply chain actually actively is part of restoring and conserving those areas. So that's the first mindset shift. And the second one then was about focusing not only on our sites within the supply chain, but actually realizing that these sites are integrated and part of a broader landscape. So once we knew about these mindset shifts, how do we implement that? We realized that all stakeholders need to help reframe how we communicate about these interventions that we need to adopt. These type of interventions at this landscape scale are much more complex. They're multi-stakeholder, they're multifaceted, often have multiple benefits connected to that. But as a business, we're used to assessing our performance really based on kind of a single issue, short-term attributional impact. We need to now recognize or get used to looking at kind of this more from a lens of there's a beneficial impact that accrues over longer term, covering multiple aspects and also being attributable to multiple actors in this space. So this is really where methodologies and metrics are so critical, because they need to kind of help companies set up this type of framework and really allow to see where do these type of interventions fit within that framework, because it's really urgent. We need to take action now, and these metrics and frameworks are really there to help corporates develop incentives to take this type of action at scale today.
Thank you very much for that, Michele. And that's a fabulous introduction for the next introduction from Mark, Rainforest Alliance, notably on Landscale, the Landscale tool. Thank you, Mark, please.
Indeed. Thank you, William and Michele. It's so great to be joining the stage with you and other panelists. You know, very briefly, for folks who are not so familiar with the Rainforest Alliance, the organization was founded about 30 years ago, and actually at the time focused on helping business be a part of the deforestation crisis and the biodiversity crisis, and help business be part of the solution there. So actually the tagline back in the day was "so practical, it's radical," which has since moved on, but that ethos of working together with corporate partners, with the broader business community, and try and help us all become champions and allies in this fight for our forests is very much what animates Rainforest Alliance through this day. And some of the solutions that you'll see if you're looking would be things like a certification label, a green frog seal for sustainable products, and support to a series of other initiatives to try and drive sustainable consumption and production, whether it's partnering on Forest Stewardship Council or support to other such market-based initiatives, we'd call them. One of those, and syncing back to what Michele raised, is pretty excited about, and it's an initiative called Landscale. It's a partnership with Vera, who've done some phenomenal panel presentations elsewhere in this session, as well as Conservation International and a host of other groups. And to Michele's point, so if we could kind of imagine that you're Nestle, or you're in her shoes, if it's okay to use the example. And so you recognize that you need to shift your mindset. You recognize that you need to be part of these broader efforts on landscape restoration. You recognize that your sourcing footprint or your investment activity or your holding portfolio is part of this much more complex integrated landscape environment. So what is it exactly that's going on? How do you even have visibility as to the issues, risks, opportunities, advances that are happening in this broader area, what other partners are doing, and how you can be part of it? Essentially, that's what the Landscale tool offers. It's a new framework that's designed to assess, to verify, and to support partners to communicate their progress on sustainability impacts at a landscape level. Think about things like high conservation area status, rates of restoration, rates of deforestation, water quality, risks of forced labor or social strife, land tenure issues. The Landscale tool kind of presents a dashboard on these items. It offers that opportunity. And then building from that, the universe of potential engagement is vast. It also serves as a means to help drive collective action, coordinated efforts, and co-investments around the types of progress at a landscape scale that we all want to see and be a part of, whether it's large-scale restoration, avoided deforestation, livelihood gains, and so on and so forth. So happy to talk further, but that's a little bit of an example of one of the types of methodologies and metrics to evaluate impact at a landscape scale that are coming out there.
Thank you, Mark. And that's throughout this summit, one of the themes is metrics, tools, the right tools, the certification, and so on. We're at a key moment in this space, and that's very important. Which is my segue to Peter Owens. And Peter is a landscape architect, as I've said, and is working on a model with Foragvest Greening on diagrams for reporting progress in landscape restoration from the design phase right through to implementation and deliverables. So over to you, please, Peter.
Thank you very much, William. Thank you, and welcome to everybody. It's great to be here today with a fantastic panel. I think after the kind introduction, William, our role as landscape architects on this project, on the Foragvest project, is a really exciting one. I was introduced to the project by Ed Adams, the technical director on the forestry side of things, and we talked at length about the processes involved in this reforestation program. And one of the things that seemed very strong was how this almost took us a design orientation. And as landscape architects, in my passion for the three things, and I think everything in a sense revolves around this. It's about people, addressing people's individuals' needs. It's about planet, clearly why we're here, the big picture, the big crisis going on out there and in here, and also about place. And I think it's really important to bring together those two ends of the spectrums of connecting the big picture with the individual's experience, and that's in many ways what we will be bringing to this project with the team. The graphic side of things is really important. As landscape architects, we're a very sort of visual profession, and the conveying of information and some very, very complex metrics and some very important metrics, as Michele and Mark and William have alluded to. The conveying of some really complex information in clear ways is such an important way of communicating success, communicating agile development of success, and how a project is relating and is developing for investors and for the various criteria of assessment. So yeah, very excited to be here and on with the presentation. Ed's got some very exciting things on forestry.
Yep. And again, this picks up on a theme repeated throughout these last couple of days. We're getting through our second day here, where people who, for the assessment, we need clear reporting and clear bridging of information from very technical level to the financials and bringing the worlds together. Over to you, please, Ed.
Yes, good afternoon and welcome to everybody here today. I'm going to start, if I may, just on a personal reflection that in my lifetime around agriculture and forestry, I've been involved in several projects which didn't necessarily have the impetus that is now being provided by concerns around carbon sequestration, landscape restoration. So it's with great excitement that I witness some of the initiatives that are gaining ground now and the attention that is being focused on them. So I'm very keen that some of the lessons that some of us older folk have picked up over the years are taken into consideration and that we're brought along with the movement, if you like. So what I'm going to talk about later on is the concept for landscape restoration through productive succession, which is the name I've given to it. And what we're talking about is using commercial enterprises as a stepping stone and a means to accelerating FLR, or forest and landscape restoration at scale. And we're engaged with a specific project at the moment in Paraguay, which will lead on to serve as a pilot for a larger rollout. So meaning just a very quick introduction to the concept of productive succession in this particular application. It's using an element of commercial forestry and silvipastoral systems backed up with framework species interventions and assisted natural regeneration to recreate ultimately an element of the Atlantic forest. So I can talk with that at more detail when the time comes, but it's essentially using productive moments in that restoration cycle.
Great, thank you very much, Ed. That's an excellent, superb introduction. And we decided to organize this by going through the bullet points because in order to maximize the concentration and the flow of our discussion. So the first one is, what about the finance systems in place? Of course, forestry in its aspects as agriculture, but even more so forestry is a major capex, involves major deployment of funds. And the fact that today we are reaching a stage where the corporate world is entering the space is a great moment, very exciting. So really there's a natural question to Michele. How do you see what are the current systems that you have in place for financing and supporting landscape restorations in your current portfolios and onwards?
Yeah, sure. So in our Forest Positive report, we actually have a great interview with Mark Zrust. He's the founder and director of Forestry Capital, who explains quite well how and why the conservation finance paradigm needs to shift or change. And what he really means by that is that we implement conservation finance within our supply chains, but probably more importantly, we make that actually an integrated part of doing business. So what that means for us is how do we link this and the need to linking this to our procurement strategy? Because as you just heard, most of our kind of impact comes from how much volume and what type of ingredients we source and ensuring that that's done in a sustainable way. So I would say kind of the private sector, especially food and ag companies, really need to collectively move from kind of managing risk to generally focusing on how can we achieve positive impact in the critical landscapes that underpin our food system. One of the things we need to be honest about, though, is this complexity, right? And the change that this requires. We need to recognize that forest conservation and restoration is about much more than just keeping trees standing and ensuring that natural systems stay intact. It's really about reshaping incentives and how people behave at scale to ensure that they can protect the forest for the long run. So for us, kind of these new finance mechanisms and systems are really there to help ensure that we can do this in a collective way. And I want to underline this word collective here, because this is really the word that leads to a lot of new questions, a new set of questions. If we do something collectively, who pays for what? How do we distribute benefits? So it really leads to new questions that haven't been kind of designed or set up that way in the past. To just give a very concrete example of how we're involved in that, Nestle is part of the RIMBA Collective. This is an initiative launched by the Forestry Capital Group. And the intention of this RIMBA Collective is exactly to develop a financial mechanism working on production landscapes that enables actors across the supply chain to work on this together at a sector level and also deliver these actions at scale in a way that is also financially viable for the long run. So that's one of the potential systems. Another example I can give is the LEAF Coalition, where they try to bring together public and private finance to address some of these questions.
Thank you very much, Michele. And indeed, absolutely critical. You talk about the complexity of these issues on the ground and so on, right through. And that is another added value that the corporate world can bring into the sector, is the know-how on structuring complex supply chains and systems and making them work and delivering. Great, so thank you for that. Mark, over to you. I will let you pick up the issue of financing straight up.
Thanks so much, William. It is indeed, I think, the question on everyone's minds. Fully supportive of Michele's examples, by the way, and those were great. I suppose for those in the audience, one question that Rainforest Alliance and some of the other folks have been talking to lately in the finance space is, it seems as though the world's at a point where there's every week or two, there's a new fund being launched with like billions of dollars committed to, X, Y, or Z SDG, climate or biodiversity target, which is insane. It's amazing and very necessary. At the same time, do the structures exist for that capital to flow into the tropical landscapes where it's most needed and for the activities that are most needed? And I think that's one of the questions that we've been asking ourselves a lot and consulting a lot with others on. And certainly the Forestry model is one great model. And I think that's kind of the, talking about mindset shifts, that's probably one of the mindset shifts that we need to move towards. To offer a quick example from a site in northern Peru, where Rainforest Alliance and many other partners have been working for several years to try and bring forward a very ambitious landscape scale initiative to try and essentially reduce deforestation by 50%, restore several thousand hectares, lift a few thousand people out of poverty, out of a universe of about 40,000, in about a 500,000 hectare area. Yeah. And they're applying these folks are applying the land scale tool, by the way, to evaluate progress and performance. This is an initiative that's kind of led by local government, counts with participation of multiple major coffee, cocoa exporters, indigenous communities, all the key players, about 25. So it's a great example of collective action and local efforts to try and drive change at a landscape scale, and folks holding themselves accountable to that using a independent and verifiable tool for performance assessment like land scale. But what happens? Everyone today works together to try and kind of retrofit existing funding sources, whether it's from government programs for rural development or infrastructure, or specialized credit lines from development banks, or grant funding, or other such direct capital investment into value chains. And that's great. And that usually covers about 15 or 20% of that broad production area. So the big bang for buck on biodiversity, on forest conservation, as we all know, is coming more from the other several 100,000 hectares that are in indigenous title or protected areas or unclear public use tenure arrangements. So financing models that can incorporate the costs and returns across the various commodity assets as well as environmental intangibles, right? And then bundle those to meet needs of corporates or investors on, to demonstrate ESG commitments, SDG commitments, so on and so forth, are, we think, a place to explore further. And certainly one of great interest and work of the organization and our partners through various initiatives.
I do, by the way, please send in questions on the right-hand side. You will see there's a possibility to put questions to the panel. I have one here, which I would just like to slip in now. Blended finance has been accused of not delivering, but it is rarely large enough to attract private capital. Now, the size of CapEx, required CapEx, has been a theme throughout this summit. There are only 160 blended finance vehicles in the globe, and of this, the average size is actually only 65 million, I'm assuming US dollars. How do we scale the funds to bring in the private investment? And please, Michele, to close on this subject, can I put that to you?
Sure. I don't know if I have the answer to this. I think as we're just saying, all of this, I think it's a really relevant point. We're just discovering and trying to figure out now how we actually develop these type of financial systems where that's enabled, and where companies like ours can actually get engaged. I also think, and this is probably one of the points I'll reiterate in the end, is we still need to invest, even if not everything is clearly set out now. Like, we need to take action now. So I think for now, it's going to be important to launch a few of these initiatives that are driving and trying to find solutions, and then learn quickly from them so we can kind of scale them up and share that across the different efforts that are put out there.
Great, thank you very much, Michele. And Ed, I know you've got some good data from the UN on required CapEx volumes for MBS solutions and reforestation.
Well, yes, I do. I don't necessarily have all that in front of me now, but I will say that in a recent article about bankable nature solutions published just this year, that the gap between government and private investment in order to realize the bankable nature solutions, or the nature-based solutions seen as being important to achieve targets, is in the region of 4.1 trillion. So it just gives you an order of magnitude what we're talking about here.
Yeah, and just to finish on that one, I mean, the UN states that we need 4 times what is invested today for to reach our net negative by 2035. So on to the next, how can corporate actors unlock carbon and financial returns? And here I'm going to turn back to you, Mark. And if you could tell us more about your land scale framework, which is your proposed response to this subject.
Sure. Thank you, William. So there's many ways to do this. One way to try and unlock more, carbon or other financial returns or co-benefits is by using credible and independent methods to be able to direct and guide and shape investments and sourcing decisions. So land scale is one framework to do that. The reason why it's one opportunity to try and unlock more of these benefits is because, first off, you get a lot of awareness, you get a lot of transparency, and then you can help target your investment into some of the most critical needs in a given sourcing landscape. Yeah, so for example, if you're a large agribusiness company and you're sourcing from, a major mosaic commodity landscape somewhere in the Amazon that probably has some, beef, dairy, palm oil, soy, and so on and so forth, you're going to have enhanced visibility on what some of the major risks, but also opportunities to drive more impact and move towards, as I think Michele and others have mentioned, kind of net positive and not just risk avoidance. So I would say in general, when you can rely on independent and credible sources to understand the impact of your investment, it's going to be an asset. Another way to look at this is, there's an increasing number of local initiatives that are led by local governments, by local community groups, sometimes by local branches of, major exporters and traders themselves, who are committing to using this tool to try and not just assess performance, but actually create these long-term action plans together to try and tackle some big sustainability challenges. So, when corporates or investors are asking questions about, hey, how can we go take the next leap forward? How can we do more to drive, a net climate, net forest positive future? And you're targeting some of those initiatives. It also helps you deliver more value, more bang for your dollar, because you're joining up with existing efforts that already have significant amounts of co-investment. So just to go back to that Peru example, it's amazing. Folks actually did an initial targeting and they're looking at about, I think, probably between $25 and $30 million in funding over a 10-year period to be able to drive some of those outcomes mentioned earlier on, deforestation reductions, restoration enhancements across this large land area. And it turns out that when you map it, there's millions, not the majority, but a significant component of the funding required to drive that. Folks are anteing up themselves, right? So you're already joining up into these efforts where you alone are not planting every tree, you alone are not protecting every jaguar, you alone are not creating every job. So you can pool resources, reduce risk, and build momentum together when you're targeting and selecting these types of multi-stakeholder initiatives that are bottom-up driven, that are committed to using the frameworks like land scale or others that give a lot of transparency on sustainability trends and drive progress against them.
Thank you very much, Mark. Michele, can I have your response to that and Nestle's position on addressing unlocking carbon and the returns in these investments?
Yeah, I very much agree with what Mark said in terms of being able to kind of link up with existing work. I think that's critical because one thing that is clear to us is that we need to act now. I think the challenge is that for companies like ours, there's actually a lot of risks out there to even start kind of unlocking it. And so there are key barriers to investment and collaboration right now, and they really do prevent companies implementing natural climate solutions at the speed that is required. And I want to quickly highlight kind of the two key barriers that at least we are seeing, and then how Nestle is addressing these. So the first one is, the first key barriers is really about the lack of clarity on how we're able to define our scope 3 boundaries. And this is really relevant because it really matters then how and what we can actually count towards our corporate net zero targets. We believe that for companies with a significant land footprint, we need a broad definition of Scope 3 boundaries. This should be a definition that includes the notion of sourcing landscapes because it's necessary to incentivize investment and action at scale. And then the second kind of key challenge or risk or barrier is really about this kind of mindset shift that I mentioned already. So we need to think about sourcing landscape, and while doing that, we recognize it's really interconnected. You have agricultural system, forest protection. So it's actually thinking about the sustainability of the landscape. And then for us, understanding how does our supply chain link to those landscapes? So it's also about increasing resiliency of farmers, of communities, increasing food security, increasing biodiversity. So at Nestle, how we're kind of at least now trying to address these barriers. The first one is through developing kind of our own in-setting framework that gives us a framework that helps to kind of act now instead of waiting until all the standards are available. And this has been a really useful way so far to get us started and kind of get us involved in many projects so far. And then the second way that we're kind of trying to address the latter, or the second challenge, is through starting to explore these type of projects. So investing in resiliency of farmers. One very kind of specific example that comes to mind is a project in Ivory Coast where Nestle is sourcing cocoa from, which is the Cavally forest. Nestle has invested over or about 2.5 million Swiss francs in that for that project. It's a 3-year project. It's implemented by the Côte d'Ivoire Forest Agency in partnership with Earthworm Foundation. And the effort really aims to conserve and restore this important forest area by taking a landscape approach. But what that means is, beyond just restoring degraded land, protecting remaining forest, it's really also increasing the resiliency and improving livelihoods of the cocoa communities and farmers around the forest reserve. So there's forest conservation, land regeneration, forest resilience that are interlinked challenges within that landscape. And with this kind of working on these topics in kind of this more holistic approach, we can combine forest conservation, restoration, livelihoods, and we hope that this will allow to kind of achieve forest protection there, and ultimately for us, obviously, as well, be a model that we can kind of replicate and bring to other geographies in our supply chain.
So yes, that holistic approach in all aspects is absolutely critical. And we're very much concerned for Foragvest Greening in the notion of permanence, and that we're not doing these projects just for 10, 20, 30, it's 50 years plus and ongoing. And this should become the new norm. So if we can now please move on, how can risks be minimized to ensure success? Peter, can I give you the microphone and maybe you'd share that with Ed, that there'll be an interface, because I'm going to put on screen your diagrams when you ask me to, so that people who are listening in can see them.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, William. I suppose the two key factors in terms of minimizing risk and maximizing success are environmental and the technical, getting it to work. And then there's the socio-economic, in terms of having a supportive environment, having the kind of holistic model that Michele was introducing, one which is, and Mark, that is self-sustaining with local economies. I think perhaps, Ed, it'd be great for you to talk through your sort of progressive productive successional approach at this point.
Certainly, thank you, Pete. And I think there will be a moment when having a slide would be useful. But in the issue of risk mitigation, let's just zoom down to the landscape level. I mean, normally for us, it's a sort of pan out, but zooming down from our discussion to a particular landscape and looking at a landscape restoration project and the importance of addressing the issue of leakage, of preventing people wandering off and carrying out potentially destructive activities elsewhere, so containment of ongoing livelihoods on that ground, increasing the efficiency of those livelihoods again, to mitigate leakage, but to involve local communities in the project themselves, because if people are involved in a project that they can see as delivering benefit, either on an economic or an ecosystem services level, then the potential for buy-in is much greater.
I'm going to put the slide on screen. Okay, so I'm going to do a screen share. Can you all see that?
Yeah.
Is that good?
Yeah.
Okay, over to you.
That's perfect. So Pete, if I'll just give a quick gallop through this, and then I'll refer back to you, because being the author of this fantastic graphic, you'll have more nuance on this. But essentially, this illustrates our project in Paraguay, where you've got a degraded forest landscape, which is predominantly now grassland. In other words, the forest has been cleared, and this is fragments of the Atlantic forest has been cleared for cattle grazing. And so you'll see top left the current situation. Moving to the right of that, we're looking at the importance of having committed a baseline survey. We're looking to protect those forest fragments, to aim to increase their footprint through assisted natural regeneration activities, and to establish connectivity between those. So you'll see the green lines there. That connectivity, in this particular instance, is established through a combination of commercial forestry plantation and silvopastoral grazing for cattle. So when we're talking about our commercial forestry inclusion, in a sense, we're taking that responsibility to meet local demand efficiently for wood fiber, for timber, for household products such as charcoal. But to ensure that that commercial forestry does not become a permanent feature in that landscape. And the way we do that is by planning through the design for succession. And that's by utilizing the fact that our commercial forest species, in this case, clonal eucalypt, is very light demanding. So we're planning from the outset to put in alleys of fast-growing, robust native species that can ultimately shade out the eucalypts once they're kept at a low level through successive short rotations. Whereas the connectivity afforded by the silvopastoral system is predominantly native species. So as you can see, as the scheme develops, we've made use of framework trees. So for those people not familiar with the concept of framework trees, it's a concept pioneered in tropical Queensland, developed in Thailand and Southeast Asia. Not so much so far in Latin America, but a framework tree species is ordinarily a pioneer or mid-successional species that has an attractiveness to frugivore or fruit-eating or seed-eating birds and mammals, which will then be tempted into that landscape by the fruits of those trees, and in so doing, they'll bring with them seed material from forest fragments surrounding this landscape. The attraction of framework trees also lies in their ability to provide niche habitat, nesting sites and so on. So you'll see that ultimately in our wonderful idealized project here, eventually through a combination of safeguarding forest remnants, by connecting them, by encouraging the colonization of the site by frugivore animals, that we're looking eventually to reconstruct the forest, but leaving clearings where necessary. So Peter, I hope I've done your diagram justice there.
Yes, no, thank you very much. I think it's, I mean, that's the notions are really exciting. It is about, you know, identifying these fragments, you know, which are the priority fragments, as we know, the Atlantic forest is left with many fragments. It's about connecting those up, and those connections being partly commercial forestry, the assisted natural regeneration, and of course the silvopastoral systems, so that then sort of working with the landscape, where the place part sort of comes in, we can get those sort of maximum opportunities for the sort of biodiversity sort of factors, for faunal movements, yeah, along to the corridors that start to turn what is effectively the small fragments into that sort of self-sustaining network, which which then looks after itself, which is the long-term goal.
I think if I may step in, another interesting aspect of the succession model is also integrates silvipastoral, but also agroforestry and therefore rural communities. How does this appeal to you, if I may ask a direct question, Michele and Nestle, as a model?
Yeah, I like this idea of kind of really designing it very much in mind with this kind of local context that is needed, because I think, Peter, you were mentioning, in the past, the approach was just to kind of put a rectangle somewhere and just say, this is what we need to do here. And this approach is much more driven by kind of understanding the local context. I think the critical piece is, as you were just mentioning, William, kind of integrating the livelihoods and the communities within those spaces and enabling, through these type of financial mechanisms, also the incentives that this can be created. So I think it's a really interesting proposition, and I appreciate kind of the thought and the design that went into it.
Great, thank you, Michele. And in discussions we've had both with the Paraguayan government, the UK, there's the priority in an absolute necessity for educating, training, bringing people together, structuring as well, supporting on the business side of things on the ground, which is very important. And that's really my segue to Mark, from your experience on how do you interconnect with the rural economy in your projects?
Oh, thanks so much, William. Look, these initiatives are driven by indigenous federations, by producer associations, by local cooperatives. These are the people who manage land. So if we're not designing interventions to be supportive as a function of their vision for how they want to steward their resources, then where are we going, right? I think someone yesterday mentioned something about ensuring that you have community buy-in, otherwise you're going to have a big problem down the road because they'll reject your project or your initiative. So that's a pretty good precept, right? So I would just say that, like, first and foremost, these are not initiatives that are imposed by the NGO community or any key stakeholder, but rather are driven by the needs and priorities of local people. I saw a ton of questions in the chat.
Sure.
Do you mind if I try and give a real quick?
Well, actually, dig in yourself, please do. Yeah, I was coming to those next, please.
Oh, okay, sorry. So yeah, first I just wanted to thank everybody for these really huge questions. And Felicity and anonymous user, if anyone wants to talk further, I'll put my email through the chat, and I'm sure others would be keen to talk as well. But so briefly, when we talk about how to scale financing and de-risking investment, I don't know how you scale the funds, but it needs to be done. And essentially, one of the opportunities that we have through landscape performance metrics is to kind of internalize what have historically been environmental externalities, right? So what you're going to be seeing is, so this land scale framework is launching publicly in a couple months after like years of development and consultation and things. And so what you're going to be seeing is more momentum that strengthens the databases and the claims on an ongoing basis around these types of interventions. And hopefully that reaches a point whereby it's a significant motivator of direct investment, and you can kind of link it into ESG requirements or other such claims. Now, obviously you need to do the kind of financial piping to make that work. There's a lot of folks working on it. Tanya Haveman at Claire Mondial is one, so she spoke earlier, she'd be a great person to reach out to. And the de-risking is, I think it's part and parcel of how we're interpreting collective action and contribution. So as I mentioned earlier, I think it's actually relatively common that in a lot of these types of landscape initiatives, you're gonna get low millions of co-investment from local groups because they've got skin in the game, but that's not quantified. So just being able to bring that in and recognize it and incorporate it into some accounting methods might be helpful for de-risking as well as other such things. There's also a quick question, I think, on like, are we aiming for risk, reputational risk mitigation, or are we aiming for positive impact delivery? And I would hope that we're kind of all on the same page at this point. That's what needed is that we collectively own driving progress. We need to support folks to be making improvements on their sustainability pathway, which is very different from just understanding where we're at. One thing is measuring, another thing is doing. We need to be behind doing. Yeah,
doing, delivering, implementation is the key to that. and that for sure is what Nestle must be focused on as well. Could you please share with us, Michele, what geographies, if you could give us an example of one of your projects in the world, and how you see it in the future, and how you will be going about reporting on that.
Yeah, I mean, we are, there are different projects that come to mind. One was the one that I just mentioned previously in the Cavally Forest, so in Ivory Coast around cocoa, and figuring out kind of the setup there. These are all meant to be long-term projects that hopefully just rather scale than just, you know, be set up and then get out of the region again. They're also, we, within kind of our organization, we need to think about where are our supply chains long-term, and kind of ensuring that we can invest very directly in kind of the sourcing landscapes and the regions that we are sourcing our ingredients from. So that's one of the areas. Another one that comes to mind where we're exploring like this landscape initiatives as well as in Russia, the Davinsky landscape. So this is very specific to my area in terms of the pulp and paper space. So understanding how do we address kind of a very different geography and ecoregion, which is more of a temperate forest with this kind of approach. And then I know we're using land scale also in kind of our palm oil work, actually, to understand how do we actually integrate that very actively in projects in Indonesia and in Southeast Asia. So those are just a few additional examples, but obviously as the biggest food company, we're kind of covering all countries that you can imagine with multiple commodities. So for us, it's more an approach of how do we prioritize, how do we get into the areas where there are critical landscapes that we do need to support, and find a good way of frameworks that we can use to prioritize our actions and our kind of investment and resources.
Yeah, it'd be interesting also, how do you actually manage your carbon finance and assessment? You know, how do you integrate that into your activities?
Yeah, Mark, I don't know if you have some insights in how companies are doing that as well. I think this is an area that we still need to work on further. We have partnership with groups that we're exploring these type of finance vehicles with, and it's also a question for us: how is this going to evolve for the organization? How are we integrating that more actively in kind of the way we do all of our work in that space? So I don't know if I can give you a very specific example right now, but maybe Mark, you have some additional insights from your interactions with corporates.
Oh my, sure, thanks. I certainly, so I am not a corporate, and I can't claim to have a definitive response to this, but I think some of the things that we see in here are, let me just make sure I got the question. Yeah, you're asking about how folks are integrating carbon as part of their broader portfolio of work. Was that right, William? Or
yeah, within the financing of it, because
within the whole financing of it. Okay.
Yeah. So from the discussions and so on, it's this thread that's coming through. It's going to be the thread to bring all the parties.
Yeah. So I one of the things that we're seeing, and welcome more comments from the audience on this, but is an increasing amount of forward payment for carbon credits that are linked to credible standards like Climate Community Biodiversity Standard, Verra, Plan Vivo, and others, which is great, right? Because then someone mentioned it earlier, I think it was a colleague at WeForest, but we have to address everything, but sometimes carbon can be a Trojan horse to doing that. And if you set up your investment correctly and you're following, leading credible standards, and you're really taking this bottom-up approach by responding to local needs, and you are, trying to work to get the benefit sharing right, or otherwise make sure it's right, then as you're kind of quantifying that carbon asset, you should also be getting livelihoods gains, biodiversity conservation gains, and so on and so forth. When we talk about scale is where I do think it's interesting to have some further thought on if there can be other methods or metrics that enable credible a carbon accounting or carbon counting, right, or otherwise claims around that, that facilitate engagement with a broader range of groups that have lower transaction costs, that can, that can help us get to scale faster. So that's, people might have strong opinions about that, right? Because on the one hand, you need to balance rigor with scalability. But that would be, I think, one constraint in purely taking a carbon play to trying to deliver on a broad suite of SDG targets, and probably an area for more attention.
Okay, thank you very much. And one aspect of carbon we haven't mentioned is blue carbon. Ed, could you please give us some thoughts on blue carbon, specifically in Paraguay, of course, and your views on that within the landscape restoration model?
Yes, certainly. And again, referring back to the pilot site that we're looking at the moment, it is fairly low lying, just adjacent to the Paraguay River, which is a blessing in terms of having a very low carbon means of taking produce from the site out on the river network, because Paraguay has a very well served barge system. But it also means that we've got quite a lot of low lying wetland, some of which is peatland. So as part of the, we could call it landscape degradation that's happened historically, is draining of some of that peatland to promote grass growth and therefore to sustain cattle production. So we see this as a very easy win, the reflooding of those wetlands and the sustaining of the peatlands in their natural state.
Great. I'm just aware of time, and managing time is quite a tricky thing live like this. So can we finish? I'm going to read a question, and I think if I could put this to you, Michele. Can we think about scaling funds by constructing PPPs by Article 6 ITMOs that blend finance into these forest and production mosaic landscapes? This way we get investment to scale by looking at projects at the levels of national transformation. Could you, a closing comment on that, please, Michele and gentlemen?
Yes, I'm not sure I know exactly what ITMOs are.
I think he meant TMOs. I don't know, sorry.
I don't know what that is either, but I would assume that the answer is yes, we should pursue whatever alternatives can help us get to scale faster.
I mean, I would add the issue of exploring at a landscape level, or even down to a farm level, the potential to add value in the supply chain. And one of the issues we're looking at is we think it's high time that there was a label for silver pastoral beef. So that's something we're working with. So how does that impact investor accessibility? It means that livelihood is sustained by giving access to a premium market, and therefore a good price for good production practice. I've dodged the question really, because I don't really know what ITMO is either, but I think it's valid in terms of resilience.
And just in this business. So thank you all very much. Really look forward to delivering before 2050. Life goes on. The planet will go on. The vegetative life is stationary in that sense. Static in that sense. You know, humans are the ones who move it around, and let's try and get this right all together, and let's give it the means it needs and requires, and do good. Thank you very much for the session. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.